Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker this evening has had a multifaceted career. His sales management, promotion, and marketing communication skills are that of a professional. He was general manager of the historic Muskoka Air Trials in Huntsville, in Orillia at the Otago Foundry and Manufacturing Plant back in the 70s. He was a sales and marketing manager exporting their Canadian auto parts to the Big Three in the USA. Our speaker also learned many business building skills as a broadcast executive. He worked alongside Betty Kennedy, Gordon Sinclair, Wally Crowder, and Jocko Thomas as Vice President of CFRB Sales. He and his partner, Larry Schachter, owned their own media marketing communications company for 15 years, working for a diverse group of clients in retail, packaged goods, corporate, and sports marketing. All the while keeping his hands on the controls in an aircraft cockpit. He also found time to raise a family of 3 boys with his special partner and wife, Ruth. Throughout all this, he maintained a keen interest in and a passion for aviation. It started with his being captivated by the glamour, daring, and sometimes scary challenges of pilots in World War II as he grew up in England. Coming to Canada as a teenager and then to McMaster University, he earned his commercial pilot's license along the way, and he still has it today. In the mid-50s, he flew with Superior Airways in northwestern Ontario. While there, he was one of the last bush pilots to fly without today's high-tech satellite, VOR, GPS, and advanced navigation aids. He is immediate past president of Collingwood's Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, Flight 85. He's a recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal and the Governor-General's Caring Canadian Award. His logbook shows more than 25 types of aircraft flown on both wheels and floats. This is his 60th year in the cockpit, and he is here to tell us about not only his bush flying, but interesting wings over Muskoka and southern Georgian Bay. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome George Daniels.
You'll get no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up my lads, bless them all.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
On Christmas 1943, pilot RAF Jeff Short came to our house as Father Christmas. After I discovered that he was really pilot Jeff Short and Father Christmas had a red outfit on, he took me in the corner and presented me with this book. So it was growing up in that environment and this motivation from Jeff Short, an RAF pilot, that got me hooked on aviation. And in this book, it says how to draw a Spitfire, how to draw a Hurricane, how to draw a Focke-Wulf 109, and basically it was the Bible of how kids in England were taught about what was going on over their heads. So when George said I got enamored with the daring and everything else that happened, I did. And many of you know that. And by the way, I'm very tickled to see the faces I know here, some of which are heroes from the Second World War, such as Peter sitting over here, and some of you who lived those experiences like myself. Others of you did not. But anyway, I really thank you all for being here. And so if this title is Adventures of a Bush Pilot, my entire life has been an adventure. And as many of you know, it's been here, there, and everywhere, and it wouldn't have got this far without the support of my good wife that's sitting over there. Who's the teacher. She always edits this, that, and the other. She's already told me I can't say at least 2 politically incorrect jokes, so if you want to come and see me afterwards, I'll tell you what they are. I can do that. But this is not a joke when you see this slide. This is a Focke-Wulf 190, and this goes right back to that 8 or 9 years of age. And for those of you who are familiar with the map of England and will know where Lancashire is, we were growing up basically within about 25 miles of the Liverpool docks in the Northern Blitz. And so downed aircraft, they taught us about downed aircraft. And the first adventure is that they all said, you don't go in any puddles because there could be stuff in the puddles from the war, and there could be shrapnel, and it could be dangerous. And of course, the first thing little boys do is to go in the puddles, because it rains in England, and they get the shrapnel because it's treasure. You trade it, and you have it, etc., etc. So one Wednesday, and in England, Wednesday afternoons were always time off, so we were going to go to Garstang. Now, Garstang is halfway between Preston and Lancaster. It's approximately 25-30 miles north of Liverpool, and it was significant in the Second World War for Alger Hiss, who was Hitler's deputy, and as you may or may not recall from your history, he left Hitler and he parachuted over Scotland in 1940 because he was convinced he was going to sell Churchill and everybody that we should get rid of the war because you haven't got a chance. So he was captured and he was put in a pub at Garstang, right on the highway, where they whitewashed it some more, and they put the searchlights on it, and they left them on all during the war. And they told Hitler, if you want to come again, that's where he is. So us kids knew that. We knew all about that. So one of the things was they downed one of these babies, and they put it on display to show us it's dangerous getting in there. You shouldn't be in the cockpit. You shouldn't do this, that, and the other. And so they took us on a parade around there, and they had it all barricaded with wire you weren't supposed, don't go in, you know, that sort of stuff. And there was, the wardens were the ladies and old men, because all the middle-aged men, like my father, were off in the war. And they said, don't go near the aircraft. So I remember turning to Norm Farrer, and we looked at each other, we ducked under the thing, and we got in the cockpit, and the next thing I know, I'm pretending I'm flying this thing with a joystick. So those were some of the things that kept me enamored with it. And of course, the submarine Spitfire was famous, and it was overhead, and that's what Jeff Short was flying. So this is a structured perspective of the length of time. So I'm bouncing around here a little bit, and so really what I'm doing is, when I came to Canada, as George said in the introduction, my real first time flying an airplane was in an Aranca C5. We've got some good old pilots in here, like John Wood and everything else who would remember those. Anyway, a C5 is a little plane with about enough width for 2 large adults, but you can get a couple of kids in there. So now we're 15 years of age. It's Cartierville Airport in Montreal, and my brother and I are looking through the fence at Cartierville, and all of a sudden this man comes over and said, would you guys like a ride? Of course we would. So we go in, and the next thing you know, we're sitting in this open no doors on the side of the thing. And we're all strapped in, Bill and myself, and this doctor is a doctor, and we're flying over St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, and the wind is all over the place, and I was just enamored. I thought that was spectacular. So fast forward, my dad he survives the war, we get transferred to Hamilton. My first day at McMaster University, I'm sitting in the thing, and the guy says to me, "What are you doing after school?" I said, "I don't know, I just got here." He said, "Well, I'm looking for a couple of guys to put up some television antennas, and then we're going to go flying and spend the money that we've earned to flying." And I said, "Oh, that's really good, count me in." So the guy next to him then said, "Well, I like that idea, I'll help you put up TV antennas." And my friend Bob McCullough said, "Well," and Twyla Faye would remember this story, I'm sure, she's sitting over there, he says, "I'm not going up on any darn roof, but I'll go flying with you." Well, the four of us became buddies, we learned to fly, and so here it is in the mid-50s, McMaster University, famous for Russ Jackson throwing footballs, I was in his class, etc., etc. So we went flying, we put up antennas on the side, and in 1956 I got my commercial pilot's license, which I still have. Thank goodness, it's all function of your medical basically, so I keep passing my medical, thank God. And so anyway, my dad was in northwestern Ontario, and he ran into somebody that was involved with a guy called Orville Wieben. Orville Wieben wound up becoming known as the Flying Santa Claus of the North, and he hired me. And I was, he said, "You don't know anything, George, you might have 250 hours, but you're going up to Sullicout, and we'll really show you what the life is all about." So this slide shows what a Norseman is, and it shows a 180 on floats, and it's sort of going the wrong way. Shows you a little bit of this. So what are we talking about here getting into training? Well, I'm at Mount Hope, and that's a typical thing that everybody talks about. You've got to get into navigation, theory of flight, all these sort of things. And the first airplane that I flew, and it's always interesting, that an Aranca Champ, some of you know about Aranca Champs around here. There's some down at Edenvale, the one I first flew is there. The Aranca Champ was donated to the Collingwood, the then Collingwood Classic Aircraft Foundation, to the now Edenvale Classic Aircraft Foundation. This was the airplane back in 1955-56. Everybody was convinced that this was such a super duper airplane, we were all going to have one in our backyard and fly to work. But anyway, it was very, very successful. This was in Mount Hope. This is a quick look at all the airports in the southern Ontario area. So anyway, I wind up learning to fly, and these are the people I learned to fly with, and there's me. No, I haven't got the pointer, Glenn, I just realized that. Have you got the famous pointer? Anyway, I think you can see me here. I'm this guy that looks like I'm about 12 underneath the wing there, but at that time I think I was 21 or 22. Oh, that's very good. Is it good? Now, what do I do? Do I just push here? Oh, that's it. Okay. So anyway, that works. So I can show that. My friend Owen Boris died a couple of years ago. He was Mountain View Cablevision, very, very successful. Anyway, that was the new Aranca Champ that we delivered at that time. This is the Toronto VFR terminal chart. It just shows Toronto here, and here's Hamilton there. So this is a little story about how we learned to fly on floats. Here's a 47 Piper P11 Cub, which was very popular. Here was some of my first logbook stuff with my medical information. So anyway, the Republic CB Amphibian and the CB Cockpit, after I'd come out of the bush, I got a job with Sanderson Ackfield Aircraft. And talk about adventuresome, for those of you who are pilots, and for even those of you who aren't, weight is a significant thing. So I come out of the bush, and they hired me as a salesman, and on the line we have a CB. A guy called Lloyd Norse walks in and says, "I want to buy that airplane you have there." And I said, "Oh, okay." I didn't know anything about a CB. I hadn't a clue. Never been in one in my life. So I said to the boss, what do I do? He said, well, you go out and fly it. So anyway, I got him in there. I told the guy at the gas pumps, fill it up. And I'm at Toronto, and I'm on this long, long runway. And I put the power to it and everything else, and it slowly rumbles off, and it takes forever. It's going and going and slow. And this guy thinks I'm teasing him. I'm not teasing him, I'm worried. But anyway, I finally get it up to about 55 miles an hour, and I'm trying to rotate and pull it back, and the stall warning indicator's going, and Lloyd's thinking it's a joke. It's not a joke at all. I can't get the darn thing in the air. So I finally rumble it into the air, and we go around, and I land. I'm so glad and everything. So I come back to Trevor Atfield, and I said, what did I not do? He said, well, you stupid fool. He said, you filled it up with gas. It doesn't, you don't fly it with full tanks of gas. You fly it with half tanks of gas. It's got wheels on it. So anyway, Lloyd Norris gets it. He goes up to Lake of Bays, crashes it in front of Phil Garrett's house on floats, Phil's on floats on a beaver. Crashes it there, walks into my office 10 days later, says, I want to buy another one. I must have learned to be a salesman. Anyway, this is a shot of Thunder Bay. This is what you do when you learn to fly on floats. You've got to learn to taxi, take off, sail, glassy water landings, docking, mooring, buoys, da-da-da-da-da. And this is the type of planes that we learn to fly on floats. I'm going backwards here, sorry. There's the CB. So anyway, here we are, 1956, 57. I think this kind of little chart about what was going on then was kind of neat. Ike was president, Pearson won the Nobel Prize, gas was only 30 cents. Now, at the rate it is going with gas now, we might even get back to 30 cents. You know. Elvis sang Jailhouse Rock, Bridge on the River Kwai with the Academy Awards, and I joined the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association. And back there I've got my buddy Robert Choquette, and we're handing around some pages about the local chapter and some maps of the Collingwood Airport and Edenville Airport. Now here's Orville Reben right here that hired me, Superior Airways, and here he is in a Hawker Hurricane way back when. They were made in Can-Car, and here is the Kaministiquia River in now Thunder Bay, which was Fort William, Port Arthur, and here he is there. He was everybody in life needs a mentor, and you've all yourselves had a mentor. He certainly was one of mine. And I wouldn't be where I am today as a pilot if he hadn't taught me a few things. So one of which was, we're in Sioux Lookout, and for those of you who do fly or have Cessna 180s, modern airplanes have electrical flaps. The older ones have manual flaps. They're either above or below or whatever. So I was assigned to a Cessna 180, and the boss comes in. It's him, and he's in another 180. And so anyway, he's saying, what are you going to do when you take off? Well, the wind was coming from another direction. I knew I had to taxi out to the larger part of the lake to take off. And I had a load on board. I didn't have people. And so anyway, I'm gingerly taxiing out. The next thing I know, he takes off right behind me, and he buzzes me about 6 feet above me, waggles his wings, gets on the radio, said, how does that look, George? Always remember that. Anyway, where did I fly? Well, this is some part of my story here, and there's a connection here with Collingwood today that I want to talk about. So anyway, here's James Bay, here's Hudson Bay, this is the Pine Tree Line, here's Sioux Lookout and all of that area, and this was the Mid-Canada Line, and way up here we can't see is the Dew Line. Now this is the 50s when the Canadian government, the United States government had a joint agreement that many of you may remember to, as a distant early warning situation, because everybody was convinced the Russian ICBMs were going to come over the pole and they were going to bomb the daylights out of either New York, Washington, Montreal, Toronto, or whatever. So basically I flew the sites across here and across here, but also I did all kinds of stuff that you're going to see. This is a huge area of Canada, and I've come down here into Winnipeg, like the Bonnie. And so anyway, here's Sioux Lookout here. Here's the Fort William, Port Arthur. Here's Lake Nipigon, which was in the news yesterday for the smashed up bridge. There's a bit of James Bay up there, so this is central Canada. Now, what is the connection with Collingwood now and that area. Well, some of us here in this room belong to All Saints Anglican Church, and some of us may remember that Bruce Mackison and a bunch of us, I think about maybe 8 or 10 years ago now, Bruce, with Mary Ratzenberger from Perger, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, from Wasaga Beach. We had an outreach program of collecting clothing, similar to what everybody's collecting now for the refugees from Syria. And we had an outreach program to send these clothes up to this neck of the woods via Bearskin Airlines and various others, and it was all donated, and it was quite a fantastic program. Here is what the Sioux Lookout base looks like today with, there's a beaver in the background. These are Cessna 180s. They're more modern ones than I flew. Sorry, I should go back. Okay, so here is de Havilland Beaver. Now, there's no doubt about it that de Havilland Beaver is a great airplane. And it's very, very good. And I knew Phil Garrett, who was the president. I knew his son, who was in the insurance business. I'd flown with old Phil way back when. And they had lots of these on the Mid-Canada. But when you go to the next slide, this is what's adventuresome. So we had Cessna 180s. Now, if you look at what the Beaver did, we could fly legally 800 pounds of load on a Cessna 180, and the Beaver had 1,100 pounds at 20 gallons an hour, and we're flying with 11 gallons an hour. Well, some part of the adventurous part of all this pilots, as those of you who are pilots in the room will know this because you've done it, I've done it, and those of you who don't know about it, we do it. And that is you take stuff out of the airplane to lighten it up so you can put more junk in there. All right, or more cargo, or more whatever. So what I would do, and there was 12 of us in that base, and we had 10 Cessna 180s, we could outfly the Beavers from point A to point B, basically 2 for 1 at half the price, because we're consuming 11 gallons an hour, and the old Beaver's chugging away at 20, and they're both about the same weight level when you bump that up to about 1,000 pounds or 1,050 pounds. And we used to do that. Don't tell Transport Canada. Anyway, here's an amphibious 180 taking off. Actually, it's a 206 with that on the back. You can see the wheels on the front here. Great airplane. Now, here's one of the ones that I really like. This is a Nordine Norseman. The Nordine Norseman was designed by Mr. Nordine in Montreal in 1935. He was a Dutchman. It's an airplane that's held together with ribs and metal and everything else. It's got fabric wings, or fabric here and some metal in the wings. It's a tremendous flying truck. And so there's no, that's like a skyrocket, sorry. So anyway, here we come here. Here's the Norseman. So the gross weight of a Norseman is 7,500 pounds, payload of 2,700, cruises 122 miles an hour. And today, Gordy Hughes, who's a couple of years older than me, Gordy's now in his early 80s, he flies DTL out of Ignace, which is up near Dryden. And I talked to him on the phone just before Christmas to say, oh, he's still working, looking after those airplanes. There are 36 of these airplanes still flying. There were 700 manufactured. Of the 700 manufactured, 500 of them were purchased by the United States military. And for those of you who remember seeing the Glenn Miller story, which I'm sure you did, you saw the picture where he boards an airplane to go across the Atlantic and is never seen again. That was in a Nordine Norseman. This is what the office looks like in a Nordine Norseman. And right about here, this one Ruth told me I wasn't allowed to tell you. And George is laughing over there. So anyway, one of the things I would do, and I learned this from Brian Maxwell, there's a nice little booklet here, put out maybe, well, it won't come out anyway, here, some of you can see this. It says, How to Fly on Floats. We'll do this for the camera. How to Fly on Floats, put up by Ego. All right, so now you can imagine that here we are on the dock at Sioux Lookout, or we're down at Fort Francis, and we've got a pile of a good situation. Take a Norseman into Fort Francis and pull up at the dock and pick up about half a dozen Americans, and they've got all their gear, they've got their fishing rods or their guns, They've got their 3 cases of beer, their this, that, and the other, and they're all ready to go, and they're going up north in the bush, and we're going to take them up to Kekabeca Falls, and they're going to catch a lot. So you get everything all loaded up, and so then what you do is you get into the cockpit, and you come around, and you crawl in, and you get in the seat here, and you put one of them in the right-hand seat, and all of a sudden you spot this nice little book up on top of the instrument panel. It says, How to Fly on Floats. So you say, oh, how to fly on floats. Let's check this out now. It says here, make sure you have the water rudders down. Where is the water rudder? And then it says here, you've got to make sure that the floats were pumped out before you boarded. Over the water, hey, Jock, did we pump the floats? Yes, George, you pumped the floats. Oh, and then it says, okay, go through procedures. So let me see now. Right about now, the guy in the right-hand seat is looking at you saying, what the devil am I doing with this clown and this contraption? So now you say, it says, make sure the mixture's in full rich and you're going to have the throttle in fine. Now he's certainly convinced you don't know anything about an airplane, and they're just about all just scrabbled out. You say, it's all a joke, but you can read it if you like. Had a lot of fun doing that. A lot of fun doing that. So anyway, here we come here now. I can't even see my own chart. This is the Thunder Bay chart, and this is around a section around Sioux Lookout. That's why I put that on there for us pilots. This goes back to the earlier slide when I fought Wolf 190. It looks like, now the reason I've got that in there is that Al Beek was one of my fellow bush pilots there, and he flew with the Luftwaffe in the war. So you can imagine the conversations we did or did not have, etc. He was very embarrassed about that. There's Sioux Lookout Dock way back when that I was there. And some part of the thing I see, Reverend Tom Crawford is here. Tom, we used to look after the ministry up there in the Northwest, the district of Algoma. We used to fly to many, many places, both with Anglicans and Catholics, and enjoyed that. Now, this is a typical jokey scene about where everybody's trying to load everything up on the dock, and the airplane saying, hey, don't load all that on me. We have to know all about weather, shelf cloud, wall clouds, and all this sort of stuff. Yes, I've had some adventurous chimes with them, and you see this picture here, a wall cloud hanging cumulus and everything else. Well, it's interesting, we just left the shot of the ministry and everything else, so I'm flying along, and I'm coming up to Lac du Bonnet in Winnipeg, and I'm young, and I'm full of zip and vinegar, and I'm Top Gun, and I'm going to get in there and everything else, and all of a sudden this weather's starting to come towards me, but I'm going to go through. I'm going to get there, and I'm at about 3,000 feet, and it's almost as if the hand of God came out and said, no, you're not, George, and just pushed me down and down and down, and I've got the throttle in full tilt, I got the wheel back, I've got all the power I can, and I'm going nowhere. I'm going down, 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 and I get to 200 feet, and all of a sudden it stopped, because the pressure gradient of the wind pushing me down, it finally hit the ground, and it started pulling me back up. So I think I learned a few things about aviation. Decision-making, flight pattern analysis, communication, adaptability, situational awareness. Everybody in here, we've got some real senior pilots, more senior than me, that had to learn all this, and they're here today because we all ran out and learned all that sort of stuff. Attawapiskat was one of our destinations, and yes, I had some adventures there. Attawapiskat has been in the news negatively so many times to do with the native peoples and everything else. I've got to remember when I was there, so this is in the mid to late 50s. This was an isolated settlement. It's right on the corner of James Bay and Hudson Bay, as you can see right here. A great Hudson Bay post, good church community. So I one day flew in there one of the first times in the springtime, and the young guy who was the assistant of the Hudson Bay Company said, George, I want you to help me to go water skiing. I said, water skiing? The temperature's right now about 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The water temperature's got to be about 36. I don't care, he says. I've been stuck in this blooming place, he said, for 8 months. I want to go water skiing. I took it water skiing. So anyway, there's a whack chart that we used to use. We used to fly prospectors and mining groups, exploration work. This is an example of what it looks like, and that's when we went there. Here we come again. I don't know why that's flipping around. Anyway, Canadian wilderness fishing. Now this is back, you know, Albany River sturgeon fishing. One of our destination things we used to do is used to go up the Albany, and the native Indians, they didn't mind being called Indians, they would catch the sturgeon and they would keep them on a chain in the river so they're fresh, and they'd wait for us to show up with the airplanes to pick up the sturgeon, and they would kill them, and then they would get them all ready for us to fly them back to Sioux Lookout so they'd then go to the fishmonger. So some part of my entrepreneurship I learned from other pilots, you always take several peanut butter jars with you. And the peanut butter jars was so you could buy the roe from the sturgeon from the Indians for 25 cents. So when I got back to Sioux Lookout, I used to sell it to the fishmonger for $4. In those days, that was money. So this was a typical prospector's camp that we used to fly into and see a lot, so you can see all the stuff there. And that's what the typical fish hunt is today. It's the Hilton by comparison. They have all kinds of good things. You know, so here they are talking about airplanes getting overloaded. Hate clients that say you've got to, you know, get too much, etc., etc. So politicians affect a change in aviation. There's C.D. Howe. He was a good buddy with Orville Weeman. We had 12 contracts in the Mid-Canada line under the C.D. Howe Liberal government. Beef came in, Beef the Chief, canceled the Avro Arrow, and all of a sudden all the aviation thing went down like that. And we were all really ticked off, big time. And this character had a lot to do with what's impacting you and I today with Homeland Security as you go into the United States. So what am I talking about? So one flight down to Fort Francis, International Falls, I show up there, and the United States Customs guy said, "Where were you born? Where were you born?" I said, "Bedford, England." "Pull over here." 3 hours later, I finally get out of there. And the reason is that Mr. McCarthy had imbued on all of their Homeland Security people on his House Un-American Activities things that he had going on, that if you weren't born in the United States, you had to be a communist. And some of you remember that. There's some laughing. Well, that's what it was all about. So then that prompted me to, about a month later, the boss let me out. I went to Toronto, and I studied up really hard. And I went before a judge, and I became a Canadian citizen, which I did not have to do in those days, but I, in my wallet, have a nice little Canadian citizen thing that says, not only am I Canadian, I'm a British subject, and all kinds of other funny things. But anyway, the one thing I learned, which is applicable today, and for the lawyers in the room, you know this, that unlike in our country, the customs people have to go by the book, whatever the policy is. Not so in the United States. You get to the United States border, if they don't like the look of cut of your jib, they can cut you off right then and there. They have more power than the President of the United States. You can call it profiling or anything you bloom well like, but that's what they can do. And some of you experience those things. So always be a good guy or gal when you're going across the United States. And here's a good example. I cut this out of the paper a couple of years ago. Border security is economic protectionism in a new guise. Well, have you ever heard of Keystone? What do you think Mr. Obama was doing? Economic protectionism, so, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, we also flew up there, Sioux Lookout Hospital Zone. It's still one of the biggest medevac situations. We used to go to nursing stations at Sandy Lake, Big Trout, Osnaburg, Webequie, Fort Hope, Round Lake, et cetera, and BR, that's before Ruth. When we were near God's Lake, the weather always went out because the nurses were very nice there. I think I'm going backwards here. Here's something I think that is as applicable today as it was when I wrote this and put this together half a dozen years ago. what is some of the problems up in native Indian land area? They're not all bad guys. As a matter of fact, a heck of a lot of them are very, very good. Because if you think of Bearskin Airlines, you think of Osiris, you think of all of the entrepreneurial things they do, they are entitled to share in some of the wealth of the land they sit on. No doubt about that. But they also got sidetracked by the Indian Act, which revised their way of doing things, and we've got some lawyers in here who will maybe corroborate this, but the impact of the Indian Act gave them, for the first time, it gave women more rights. It gave them rights to have spirits, that's alcohol. And they wrote that before some other thing called weed came in. But they figured out how to get that too. And unfortunately, yes, some of them have abused that. Some of their elders have also abused one heck of a lot of things underneath this, that, and the other. And that's also what's going on there. However, what's also happening, and that is, and that was in the National, if you saw the National Post Saturday's edition, there's a whole front section that talks about Indian band entrepreneurship and tripartite agreements between them as the owner, the development, and local government. Well, that is happening more and more and more. But of course the media, and for those of us who've been in the media, and my buddy Wally Schubert is at the back there from CFRB days, he certainly knows how they go for the sensational and this, that, and the other, because that makes all kinds of noise. They don't talk about the underbelly of everything else that's good, etc., etc. So those things are happening in that community. Here's something to do with Dwight. That's near our cottage, where I joke about it being Dwight International, so we have a little airport there. Here's a picture of me in June 1957. There I am with my McMaster jacket. All these guys are dead now. There's Randy McDonald. He was my boss. Brian Maxwell was the guy that taught me how to do this, how to fly a floats trick. We had a lot of fun doing all that. So anyway, here we come to Muskoka. Here's Muskoka Air Trails with DTL. You saw that picture. Lake Vernon. When I came out of the bush, my buddy Bob McCullough and I, we took that facility over. There's Gordy Hughes. I'm sorry the picture's a little rough. This is there. We were back here in September '08. I went up to see him. Just a great guy. This is a Waco. A lot of these Wacos, I'm sorry I don't have a picture of one on floats, but they were a good airplane. And this was the story of Muskoka Air Trails. Now, Tommy Higgins was a famous pilot, as was Bun Paget, and they used to come down into the Collingwood area here. They were well known. Tommy Douglas, we bought the stuff from Tommy. He was a character. There's Bob McCullough and Jim Field, and some of us are in the Canadian Hall of Fame, Aviation Hall of Fame. Here's our letterhead, and there's my 180 with my picture in it. In those days, and I made the front page of that magazine back then. This was this presentation I gave in Huntsville last June. Jack Otosky flew with me way back when, and Doug Tideman, 3 bush pilots, old characters. I'm going to show you some slides here in a minute to talk with Howard Hughes. For those of you who saw the film The Aviator, it's the story of Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was in the business of basically putting the old flying boat out of business. These were the big Grumman, how to cross the Atlantic before we had jets and DC-8s and all that sort of stuff. And here's Howard Hughes. Well, in my logbook, it's September of 1958. It says I was in the circuit with Howard Hughes when he flew in to Malton with Trans World Airlines. I always remember him being on the radio saying, "This is TWA, XYZ, whatever, requesting land." And you could just hear the rest of the airplane say, "We better get out of the way, here comes Howard." And anyway, he was quite a thing. Larry Milbury, I flew Cessna 182 CKJY, also September of that year, when Jan Zurakowski did the first test flight in early September. September the 8th, 1958, Zurakowski flew the Arrow, and I was in the circuit with him with that particular airplane about 1 week later. So that was, and I wrote that in my logbook, so I guess I wasn't dumb or something like that. But there's a Collingwood story here. The Martin Baker Company built and designed right here in Collingwood that ejection seat that was right in there. And so that ejection seat also, Martin Baker Collingwood life-saving plant ejection seat. So that also went in the that jet that is at the Hamilton Warplane Heritage Museum. There it is right over there. Now, Warplane Heritage Museum was started by Dennis Bradley. Some of you may remember Bradley Meats. And of course, I learned to fly at Mount Hope. So I have quite an affection for that. So there's a bit of stuff. Here in Collingwood, we have the Clyde Aircraft Manufacturing Company in 1944. It was located where, you remember, Kaufman's Furniture was the big factory out in the west end of the city. And I thought this was rather unique. And of course, the Collingwood Library has been very helpful in digging up some of these pictures for me. And I thought the fact the 1944 Clyde Aircraft baseball team, women's baseball team, here's Hilda Stevenson and Bessie, this, that, and I've got the original picture. You can go and get that if you like. Now, as we're talking about Southern Georgian Bay and what was going on, this is rather interesting. Carol Stewart gave me this map of the way Collingwood looked in the early 1900s. So you see here Collingwood, and here's what was called Sunbury at the Batteau, and here is Wasaga Beach, of course. Now, there's a bit of controversy here, but I went over, this is right behind the Batteau Church. Here's the road to the existing airport, which is basically in here. But there was an airstrip there, and Ken Richardson told me this morning he went over there a few times to see Harvards in the Second World War that had used that field as they come out of Edenvale. And of course, here's a picture of Huey Thompson's farm. I call it Stainer International. And again, I must have done an awful lot of flying in September 1958 because it says I flew a Piper Tripacer in there. And of course, in the 30s, we're going to tell you in a few minutes about the girls who flew in and out of there. And here's Camp Borden down here, 100 years old this year. Very important thing. They've kindly donated to their aviation museum a print that's at the back of the room that the Collingwood Historical Society is putting on a raffle to generate some money. But anyway, they donated that. Milan Krupa of Edenvale Aerodrome paid for the nice frame around it. But anyway, big things going on at Base Borden. And some of the big things that were going on in the 30s is there were 3 women who were really well known throughout the world. And I'm going to start showing you now about Amy Johnson and Amelia Earhart. But what I'd like to put into some things into perspective is that back in the 30s, and you may have read about this or know about this, a lot of aviation was thought of as a daredevil activity. So you had wing walkers and people were going to show all this silly billy stuff. But there was another faction that said, hey, no, this is entrepreneurship, this is transportation and communication, and the media helped drive that. And they did in England, and they did in the United States, and they did in part in Canada. So they put up prizes for the King's Air race, and this, that, and the other race, and how to go from here to there. They all wanted to be other Lindberghs. So the story of Beryl Markham, if you ever saw the movie Out of Africa, which is the story of Kenya and Uganda, any of you see that? So you're nodding your head. Well, if you haven't seen it, you should go see it. It's a great movie. It's the story of Beryl Markham. She was a tomboy. She was born in Kenya. She learned to fly. She flew from Kenya to England, which is one heck of a long distance. She also then flew to Australia. She's really quite well known. They made a movie about her, as you could tell. And then, of course, we come to Lady Linda Amelia Earhart. She came to Wasaga Beach in 1932, and this is a picture of her taken in 1928 by her husband, George Putnam. Now, Putnam Publishing in New York was a huge enterprise, big. They were probably the first Uber media company that specialized in promoting heroic people, heroic situations. And so he took her under his wing. They got married, And so many of the things we know of her today, he really promoted. And so the other thing that was going on way back when, and here's the Ford Tri-Motor, the Ford Air Tours of 1925-31. They weren't in the daredevil business. They were in the business of how to, we're going to take people from point A to point B. This is going to be the new airlines of the future. And they certainly came up around here. And by the way, I've got all of half an hour flying a Tri-Motor Ford out of the Toronto Island Airport, and I've also flown it in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Here we are, a shot of Wasaga Beach, and we're going to come along here now to Amy Johnson. Here's Amy Johnson, and here she is there, and here's Amelia Earhart. And we're now going to talk about the National Air Tours, and this was where they did a sort of a commemorative thing at the Air Tours from 50 years before, or 80 years before, the National Air Tours. And they came all over North America. They came to Wasaga Beach. They were in the business of showing that these airplanes are really good and they're going to go someplace. Here's today's sectional chart of Southern Georgia Bay. Here's Nottawasaga. Here's the Collingwood Airport down here. And so we come to today. So here's the Collingwood Airport, here's the Edenvale Airport, here's the Midland Airport, here's Base Borden. Now Edenvale, and we were talking about Huey Thompson's strip, which was right in here someplace. John Wood came to be bored by me this evening, but John knows more about Edenvale Airport because that's where he learned to fly, and he's sitting over there someplace. Wave, John, where are you? He won't wave. Oh, there he is. Well, John is a fantastic pilot. He used to fly with me with the Cessna Cardinal. We miss you, John. But he and I have been flying quite a few times. But John can tell you after this meeting more about Edenville than I can. However, the other story is Ailing and Reed first flight from, with the Trail of the Caribou. They bought this airplane from Amy Johnson, and her husband, and they fixed it all up. And they flew to England from in 1934, and that was famous. And if you go down to Wasaga Beach, you'll see there's a memorial to that. They've got a pylon with a replica of the airplane. It's quite an interesting story. So Canada was really there. Now, I want to put my glasses on and stay on that slide for a minute, because we're talking about three women that really did dominate the news and the headlines and everything else. But aside from the males flying, and we've got a lot of Canadian male aviators from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out our famous women aviators. And some of them, one of them, because I know her from working with her, is Jackie Perrin. Wally Schubert and I worked with Jackie. You may have seen her on the CBC. But there's some of them that go back to 1927. Lorna Debicki was the first female parachutist. And then Elsie McGill graduated from the University of Toronto with an engineering degree and became one of the top mechanics to do with aviation as well, and was well known in Canadian circle. Vi Mistad was really a big name. And Edith Denny worked the Goodyear blimp that we saw around in the 30s and the 40s. Felicity McKendry, Marion Orr. I talked to Ken Richardson earlier today, and he talked about talking with Marion Orr. She died a few years ago, but she was a phenomenal woman. There was the first female airline pilot in Canada was a gal called Rosella Bjornsson. She worked for Transair. The first two females to fly F-18 jets, one of them who was Deanna Brosseur from Quebec. And of course, the last two I really want to single out is Lieutenant Colonel Mary C. Charmelay. Not only was the commander of the famous Snowbirds, she flew the Snowbirds. She was the leader of the Snowbirds back about 10 years ago. And we've all heard of our female astronaut, Roberta Bondra. So that's, if I'm concentrating or showing something about Amelia Earhart, but it's because Putnam said you better promote him, George, I guess. I'm joking. But anyway, there's that. Now, there's the plaque in Wasaga Beach. of the Ailing and Reed flight. You can go and see that. And then here's another nice little sidebar. Many of us go down to the Sovereign for a meal in Creemore, and right across the road on the cross street, there's this little picture up on the wall. Well, this is a takeoff of the Curtis Jenny, and if you look in the background, you can see some other aircrafts there. Now, they talk in the lower right, it's been destroyed a little bit, but it talks about Creemore Aviation. And the Creemore Aviation, according to A Glimpse of Creemore Past, which is a great little book that you can get out of the library, or Melissa's back there, she's got all kinds of good things with museums, and Carol have. Anyway, this was a book by Edward Maynard and Joan Maynard and Colleen Stamp. And they did this on behalf of the village of Creemore and the centennial in 1989. But what's intriguing to me, not only did they reference the fact that all the pilots in Creemore came out of Borden and flew back there in 1917-18, they also flew into Ernie Cleave was one of their pilots in 1917, and he landed in Granger's Field down there. And also John Melville wound up being quite famous because he crashed. He crashed his C-138. He wasn't hurt. But see, that's the other great thing about those old biplanes. They were high-lift aircraft. They didn't need long takeoffs. They could float. They could glide. Anyway, go and look at that when you're down in Creemore next. I think it's rather fascinating. Another fascinating thing, and so I mentioned John Wood a few times, between John and Ken Richardson and everything else. Here's a super-duper photograph of Huey Thompson Stainer Air Service. September 1958, I flew in there with the Piper Tripexer, and of course Watson Motors, and Tom Schulte and his wife, Bev, is a Watson. He was really enamored with aviation. I think he had 2 or 3 of them. I'm sorry these pictures are a little fuzzy. They were downloaded off a print, but you can see how we put this on floats. This was in the Nottawasaga River. And then there is a gas pump right in the middle of the field, which I always think is marvelous. And here's the EDE right there. There's the thing. So John remembers this. So also, John, when you sent me over there to look at him, we talked about Piper Tripacer. And here's the Tripacer I flew. Now, for those of you who don't know about a Tripacer, you've got to be 3-handed. I mean, this is really all your piloting skills because you've got no toe brakes. You've got a handbrake, then you've got to turn around and worry about the throttle, then you've got to worry about the trim, you've got to worry about everything. So it's really quite challenging. And this one I did practice on. I didn't just get in cold turkey. Anyway, the guy bought it, and that's what they look like, and that was there. And then here today we have Edenvale Aerodrome, and that's what it looks today. Milan Krupa, they built that new 4,000-foot runway about 4 or 5 years ago, and of course somewhere in the middle there is this mound that you've probably heard about, but it does exist, and where they built the underground bunker for the provincial government cabinet members to go in with the war where they were going to be attacked. So anyway, here's Edenvale today, and it's quite flourishing. It's very, very good. We're very tickled that Milan decided to sponsor the picture. There's their logo. Also there is the Edenvale Classic Aircraft Foundation, formerly the Collingwood Classic Aircraft Foundation. For some of you who may remember that, they were here in Collingwood. They flourished quite significantly. Then when all the nonsense, the airport, who owns this and who owns that, one day they had to close up everything as John Wart sold something. The town argued, and so what else is new? So they moved to Edenvale. So they now have the museum down there, and it is dedicated to the RCAF detachment that was there. And I think that's when you were there, John. Am I correct? In 1941-45? Yeah, you were there. John's nodding his head, so you can go and ask him more about that. So anyway, here's their Tiger Moth they have. They have a Tiger Moth down there. As you know, you can book moth flights on that. Bob McIntyre, who was the weatherman on CKVR, you remember him talking about that all the time. Well, he knows how to fly that, so that's a look there. Now, Base Borden, 16th Wing, 100th Anniversary National Historic Site. That's the sign you see when you drive in there. Now, remember, this is a military base, but it's taxpayer funded. You and I are entitled to go there. You could go there, and they've got a great facility. So anyway, this particular airplane, the de Havilland 504, the 100th anniversary print is back there. These hangars are still there, and they can't take them down because they're heritage sites and they need fixing up. They need a spare $10 million to fix them up properly. But they're there, and they're going to have a big shindig in June. And they're going to have the snowbirds there, and they're going to do this, that, and the other. And maybe they'll land a lot of the airport, at the Collingwood Airport. I suspect they will. So anyway, there's the Avro 504, that's what we call it. There it is. That's a real one. That's a flyable one. They're going to fly that. Here they are 100 years later. That's flyable. That's in the Air Museum. They're going to fly that right then and there. And here's some other thing. In the old days, they used to call it canvas and string. I thought this was a rather interesting thing for you to see. Now, here's our Collingwood Regional Airport. It's basically run by 3 organizations: Collingwood, Wasaga Beach, and Clearview Township. You notice the town of Blue Mountains is not there, much to our frustration. This is our major 5,000-foot runway. It's really great. Now, when I supposedly retired, when I came here in 1999, there were about 50 hangars on the airport. There's now over 100. And some of these right here are, they're $600,000 hangars. This one here is managed and run by Geordie Dalgleish, which is basically Loblaws and the Galen Weston Trust. So they use this as a base to go up north. So Collingwood is a center for an awful lot of stuff. Also, it could be said, and I hope the town and everybody's listening, that basically as Toronto gets busier and busier and busier, we are a satellite of Toronto. This is a great economic engine. It really is. And we fly our Cardinal out of there. It's a great airport. This is the businesses that are at the Collingwood Regional Airport, employing nearly 3 dozen people. Now, because I'm on a roll, and how much time have I got left? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? I'm going to answer the question before you ask me. In the paper, it's been said, why is the council holding up this access development thing that they want to do? And I'll show you where they want to do it. Oh, there's our grass runway. So the development is right about here. Okay, so that's the Van Size property as I understand it. So really imagine you had some businesses here, and they just want a nice little taxiway right to there. What's the big deal there? Why are they holding all this up? So somebody said, well, what do you think of it, George? Well, as George said, when I was, and he was also in Orillia, and I was the general sales manager of Otago in Orillia, we had an electrical induction foundry. In other words, we did not belch smoke. We made super duper steel ductile iron castings. We made rear axle pinion flanges, brake, this, that, and the other, etc., etc. 400 employees. We won a modest little concession out of the then mayor, Mr. Dalcourt, and his council, similar to what these guys wanted here. So after they fiddled mucking around for about a year, we had a management meeting one day, and I was the general sales manager. And the boss said, well, George, what do you think? I said, well, we could sell more to General Motors and to Ford and to this, that, and the other if we had more capacity, which is what we want to do. But we're hung up. And some of the guys said, well, why don't we move? So we did. We moved to Brantford. And then all of a sudden, what hit the fan in Orillia. Everyone said, well, what are you leaving for? So anyway, I'm reminded of that little story. So anyway, when politicians and bureaucrats get going, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, because that's what's at stake and more. That doesn't show the Canadian military coming into the Collingwood airport to land all of their aircraft to go and see the Meaford base, where a whole bunch of those Syrian refugees are going to be parked in a few weeks' time. Doesn't tell you anything about that on that list, but they do. When they come in, boy, and they come in with those great big aircraft, and they need all that fuel, Pierre is just laughing away at the gas sales. When they come in from Petawawa with the special helicopters on a training flight, that's not on there either. But we service them, we look after them and everything else. But it's on-time delivery to Detroit, and the plants here need to get the stuff there at 5:30 in the morning. You and I don't wake up at 2:30 and hear the F-27 is going into that runway. But they do, and they pick up parts to make online delivery at 7 o'clock in the morning in Detroit. This is a huge economic asset. You know, it really is. Anyway, there's me, and oh, Diane's in the audience today. Thank you for coming, Diane. There's our Cecil Cardinal. And there's my buddy Doug Tiedemann. Now, this is the other thing we do. We've got Copa Flight 85 out at the airport. This is us giving some young eagles. It was called then, now it's called Copa for Kids. Robert Chiquette has got some brochures back there. We're kind of booked up for this year already, as Robert pointed out. We're going to take a whole bunch of girl guides and other young females as part of this program in Women in Aviation Week, which is the first week of March. And then later on in the spring, we're going to take a bunch of scouts, and we're going to take a bunch of who we really enjoy taking, the big brothers and big sisters, because they're not underprivileged, but they certainly need a hand up. So we enjoy taking them, and they all know us very, very well, so we enjoy doing that. And we're not trying to say you've got to become a pilot. Heck, they might decide to design the next space arm, as far as we know. Or they might become a travel agent. Or they might become an aviation medicine doctor. We just want them to know, and you to know, that aviation is as vital part of transportation and communication as is your computer, your telephone, the car you drove in tonight, the train you may get on, or whatever. That's all we're really trying to say. We're here to stay. And here's a group of kids we took last fall. And there's the Cardinal back there. Here's me. Here's George Elliott. There's their teacher, Suzanne Morrison. And we gave them all of this. We had a really fun time. And when these kids write back the thank yous, you should see the thank yous we get. They're absolutely marvelous and very, very precious. And it really makes you feel good for having volunteered to do this no-charge program. Anyway, I'm coming towards the end of the thing, and this 100th anniversary of Canadian Aviation logo was a special logo put out by the government, so we applied to see if we could put that on our letterhead. So it's just like Bruce saying we're glad to be associated with the museum and everybody else. There's nothing wrong being patted on the back by the brass, so we got patted on the back with that. And so recently the report on business featured a glass cockpit in a major airline, and it pointed out that connectivity has improved our lives in many ways, but we first established a framework that considers our privacy. Well, that's fine, but this is what they call the glass cockpit. Now, believe it or not, for those like me who learned what they call the old steam whistle gauges, the round ones, it's not that big a deal, because all they did is they did make vertical telemetry instead of round. But what's happening, and again, before I get asked the question, I'll answer it now. So you now hear about how come they've got all these fantastic airplanes and something crashes, or something goes kerflooey. Well, what they're really discovering, everything is so blubbered automated, and it really is, that the pilots don't have to do anything. And some of them have forgotten how to fly. Really have. They really have. So when Ruth and I go to Florida next week, the first thing I do is I check in the Naples Flight Center. I'll do my check ride. And I will see next to me a whole bunch of young people who are learning to get their commercial pilot's licenses. And by the way, a whole bunch of them will be from Germany, France, England, because it's weather down there. And they'll be learning the glass cockpit version of this, and also the round dials like I learned, so they have to learn both. And they will learn, again, how to fly a tail dragger airplane like John learned to fly on and I did. Oh, I just realized there was a slide I skipped over, John, about the tail aircraft that you flew. Well, anyway, we'll have to do this again, John. But anyway, flying a tail dragger, which is really, when I showed you the Aranca Champ, well, way back when we all learned to fly an Aranca tail draggers, now you have to get a special certification to say you know how to do a tail dragger. Well, I know how to do that. Well, these major pilots are being told to go back to school to understand the feeling of what a stall is like. Because they've forgotten. And you gotta have the feeling. Which then brings up me getting close to the end of this presentation. What is it like to be a pilot? You're all pilots. You know how to ride a bicycle? Sure you do. Riding a bicycle is balance. Flying an airplane is balance. There's a turn and bank indicator in there. It looks just like a carpet is level. You keep the ball in the middle, your bum is parallel with the earth the right way. You have the joy of skiing down a hill. We're out here with Blue Mountain Heaven. You're all skiers, or many of you have been. The satisfaction of getting to the bottom of that hill by yourself. Wasn't your mother that got you there, or your father, or your school teacher, or whoever it was. You. You did it yourself. We got a tremendous amount of beautiful cooks and chefs in here. You ever bake a super duper cake and come out feeling you put it all together just right? Well, it's that sort of feeling that you get when you land an airplane or when you take it off properly. It's you against whatever. You've accomplished something. You are all accomplished. And that's what a pilot feels. And that's why we stay involved with aviation. It's a self-imposed standard of excellence of some part of transportation and communication that is a precious little thing to be involved with. And I thank you very much for listening to me. I thank all these people for helping me. And I have a feeling, John Wood, your name is not up there, and I feel bad. But we'll put you on the next one. Thank you. That's down the bottom.
Does anyone have any questions of George? I'm sure you're all curious about some of the things he's told us. I guess the development of the airport was the biggest question, so he's answered that. Yes.
I wonder if George ever got a chance to meet Walt May or Marie Wright he was on the post pilot way out in the west.
I met Walt May in Sioux Lookout way back when, very briefly, when he came in with Max Ward. And that would have been 57, 56, 57. The other person I don't know. But anyway, there were. Walt May is in that book called The Pilots of the Purple Sage. Are you familiar with that book?
No,
Well, he's in that book. He's one of Canada's famous bush pilots, absolutely, no doubt about that.
Any further questions?
George.
Way at the back there.
That's Wally. Just yell, Wally, I'll hear.
George, would you mind telling us what it was like to fly that Ford tri-motor in Toronto? Because that was an ancient aircraft at that time, and you flew it for a good half hour for sure.
That's right. Well, I think you and I both were at CFRB at that time, or I was with Standard and you were CFRB. Anyway, there was a guy called Patty Priestman. Patty was the sales manager, as you may remember, of American Airlines. And American Airlines then were just launching the new first tri-motor jet. So they flew it into Toronto. They found the tri-motor Ford that had been an original American Airlines one. They found it in a field in Mexico. They refurbished it, and they flew it into Toronto with a tri-motor jet, and it's out at Malton. So now the tri-motor jet isn't going to go into the island, but the tri-motor Ford could. So I forget how I schmoozed my way in, but anyway, Patty Priestman got me in there, so you ask how it is. Well, in those days, they didn't have all the hydraulics they have now. So when you were on the machine, it was you. So as you're pulling it back, it's heavy, and it's really heavy, so therefore you've got to get up speed. And of course, it's lumbering along, and I took it off, and so we were heading east, and I turned around, and I could feel it being heavy. Anyway, It's in my logbook. The guy who was the captain, lover seat, I can always remember that. You always remember the key people. He took it out. He said, okay, George, you put this in your logbook. You've got half an hour. I did not land it at Malton. I took it off. He landed it, but I was in the right-hand seat. He said, follow me through. Then I was in Oshkosh at the big air show there. Some of you may know it's the largest air show in the world. It's always the last week of July. They have thousands of pilots show up there. They have the biggest aircraft in the world show up there and the smallest pop bottle. Anyway, they have a fleet of tri-motor Fords show up, and there's about 2 or 3 dozen of them. And of course, I managed to get in one again there. I didn't fly it, but I was able to sit in the front rank next to the pilots. It was a thrill to be able to fly one of those. Very heavy.
George, I also recall that the oil pressure was outside on the wing.
Well,
It wasn't in the air.
they had a lot of, in some of those pictures I showed, they had a lot of external information gauges, including the fuel gauges were outside. And yes, the Ford Tri-Motor had that. And one of the reasons they came here in those days to Wasaga Beach was because engine management was a sensitive issue. So some of those big radial engines, you know, you either had 5 or 6 or 9 cylinders. You could blow a cylinder quite easily if you didn't do it right, and then you had to replace it, which, by the way, only took maybe an hour, hour and a half. But they had a lot of external things. So some part of external everything. We saw a lot of old biplanes there. When I came out of the bush, I went to work for Sanderson Ackfield Aircraft, which I may have mentioned. Jack Sanderson was a Canadian pilot in the First World War. He showed me and told me why pilots back then had swagger sticks. They all walked around with their uniforms and swagger sticks. The reason they had a swagger stick is that the fuel gauge was above their head, outside sort of thing, and it would freeze. And they would have to take their stick and whack it to get the fuel to flow to the next tank. That's why they had swagger sticks. So all these things make sense, right? But the reason they came to Wasaga Beach, Wally, and by the way, Wally lives in Wasaga Beach, so he knows. The reason they came to Wasaga Beach is if they took off and they had an engine failure, say at 150, 200 feet, they just put the nose down, glide in, fix the engine, and then take off again. 17 miles of super duper runway. There's a question way back there.
George, all the pictures I see of bush planes and flights in the north are fixed wing aircraft.
Yes.
Is there much use of helicopters up there?
Yes, a ton, lots of them. But obviously you can tell I'm not a helicopter pilot. We had one of our colleagues here, no longer on this earth, Ted Cook was a helicopter pilot. Greg Taylor over there can tell you lots about him. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He was in the military. He became a teacher at CCI. He knew a lot about helicopters. I've personally never been that enamored with helicopters. I've flown in a few. I always think that a wing that is more substantial than something like a blade like this is not quite as, it's a little safer, let's put it that way. However, my wife's nephew, David McDonald, graduated from Trent University, I think, Trent University. The first thing he did is he got his helicopter pilot's license and went up north in BC and was a helicopter pilot. I think they're a different breed in a way. Maybe they might fit the daredevil mode, I don't know.
Okay, thank you, George. We've had some questions here about ancient airplanes, and I guess we all know that the most ancient airplane was the one that the Wright brothers invented, and it was said that they delighted all the experiences of flying. But for a little trivia lesson here tonight, I'd like to ask you, what one experience did they never experience?
So, okay, speaking of,
What one experience did the Wright brothers never have?
skiing.
That experience was, they didn't lose their baggage. Anyway, George, we really enjoyed this. We enjoyed this talk very much. And I think we're going to go away from this meeting with a real high. And I've never seen anyone spoken here tonight. Is there any further questions of George? I'd just like to thank you, George, and present you with a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. George, you gave us an